The early history of the London Underground was full of incidents, but I don't think any were quite so dramatic as the time in 1864 when a train just straight up exploded. The incident took place on the 9th of May at Paddington, what's now the Hammersmith and City and Circle Line platforms. At that time, this station was owned by the Metropolitan Railway, and this was considered a separate station, known by the name of Bishop's Road. The Metropolitan had only opened in January 1863, and in that time a lot had happened. The Metropolitan Railway at that time was worked by steam. It would be over 40 years before electrification arrived. The line was less than 4 miles long, and the railway company had intended to borrow locomotives and rolling stock from the Great Western Railway, who owned the main line station at Paddington. And that was how it worked at first. The Metropolitan owned the railway, the Great Western ran the trains. But things soured very quickly. The Metropolitan thought the trains were too infrequent and the service as a whole was poor. And the Great Western Railway complained that the Metropolitan hadn't provided goods facilities at their stations, because they used to run goods trains on the Underground in those days. The long and short of it was that the Great Western took their toys and went home. And by toys I mean all the Metropolitan Railway's trains. Fortunately, help was at hand from another company, the Great Northern Railway. The Great Northern Railway also had a connection to the Metropolitan at King's Cross, and, as it happened, they had been experimenting with adapting some of their engines for tunnel running. So they very hastily fitted a number of locomotives with the appropriate equipment, basically a pipe running from the chimney to the tender tank, and sent the locomotives to the Metropolitan. The engines, frankly, did not work very well. The biggest issue was that the pipe kept coming off. Well, no, that was the most common issue. The biggest issue was the one that became apparent on the 9th of May, 1864. On that day, locomotive number 138 was being prepared to leave on a train to Farringdon Street. Number 138 was a member of the 116 class, an 060 goods engine that had been built in 1851 by R&W Hawthorne Limited. As a westbound train entered the station, the driver of number 138 received the signal to depart, sounded the whistle, and opened the regulator. For non-rail enthusiasts, that's the big red lever that lets steam into the cylinders and makes the engine go. And it went. Specifically, it went boom as the boiler exploded. The explosion was enormous. Bits of engine were blasted through the station roof, causing a partial collapse. Damage was also done to the arriving train and one of the walls. Oh, and to the hat of a passing cab driver. First the Underground steals his passengers, then they ruin his hat. The locomotive's dome was found next to the Grand Union Canal, and another section of boiler landed outside the Dudley Arms on Harrow Road. Incredibly, there were no fatalities. 4 people were injured, the driver and fireman on the locomotive, as you might expect. So, too, was the guard and one of the passengers on the incoming train. A report on the incident was made by Captain H.W. Tyler. The cause was determined to be a defective boiler caused by poor maintenance that had not been spotted by inspectors. Boiler explosions were a distressingly common event on railways in the 19th century. In fact, that very day another one would occur at Leominster in Herefordshire. This was for a combination of reasons. Poorer quality materials, lower safety standards, and the fact that the science just wasn't as advanced. Number 138 likely had some undetected weakness. If I were to theorise, the opening of the regulator caused a reduction in boiler pressure, which in turn resulted in the rapid creation of steam, which created a shockwave within the water inside the boiler, which was too much for the weak spot. I don't know though, I know almost nothing about boiler explosions, and that's why I had to close my plumbing business down and leave the country for a while. One interesting fact from a historian's point of view is that there are no surviving records of which engines the Great Northern Railway lent to the Metropolitan. As a result of the accident and the subsequent report, number 138 is one of the few that we positively can identify. All things considered, the Metropolitan Railway were probably glad when their own brand new locomotives arrived the following month. No longer would they have to rely on companies that might turn on them or blow them up. You might say it was boom time for the Metropolitan Railway. Well, I hope you enjoyed this high-pressure tale from the tube. If you did, please do leave a like and consider subscribing and hitting the bell icon for more. I'd like to thank my ever-generous donors on Ko-fi and Patreon. You are the thorough inspection to my locomotive boiler. If you'd like to be as cool as them, links in the description below. And I'll see you all again very soon for another tale from the tube.